The nation was on its knees. The army shattered by a surprise attack. In the command bunker, panic began to set in, but one man held firm. As Chief of Staff, David Dado Elazar became the calm center of the storm, the anchor for a country adrift in chaos. He would lead his soldiers to one of the greatest military comebacks in history. Yet this incredible victory would ultimately demand a sacrifice he never expected: his name, his career, and his heart. Your support matters. Like, subscribe, and leave one comment. Thank you. David Elazar was born in 1925 into a world that seemed both ancient and secure. His home was Sarajevo, a vibrant crossroads of cultures in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, where mosques, churches, and synagogues shared the same skyline. Raised in a prominent Sephardic Jewish family, his childhood was steeped in the rich traditions of a community that had thrived in the Balkans for centuries. He was a bright, energetic boy, known to everyone by his Serbo-Croatian nickname, Dado. This name, a term of endearment, would follow him from the bustling markets of his youth to the highest echelons of military command. Life was a tapestry of family, faith, and the easy coexistence of diverse peoples. It was a world of stability, a reality he took for granted, never imagining it was a fragile piece poised on the brink of annihilation. The security of his childhood was shattered in 1940. The shadow of Nazi Germany stretched across Europe, and its darkness was rapidly approaching Yugoslavia. At the age of just 15, Dado made a decision of impossible maturity and foresight. He joined the Youth Aliyah, a movement dedicated to rescuing Jewish children and bringing them to mandatory Palestine. The farewell to his parents and family was a moment of profound, unspoken tragedy. It was a hurried goodbye, filled with the hope of reunion, but haunted by the terror of the unknown. He was leaving everything he had ever known behind for a distant land and an uncertain future. He would never see his family again. They, along with most of Sarajevo's Jewish community, were murdered by the Ustaše, the Croatian fascist regime allied with the Nazis. This catastrophic loss became the defining event of his life. The news of his family's fate, learned later, did not just bring grief. It forged an ironclad purpose within him. He was a survivor, a brand plucked from the fire, and the status carried an immense, lifelong weight. He felt an almost sacred obligation to the millions who had perished, a vow that the Jewish people would never again be led powerless to their slaughter. His journey to Palestine was not the hopeful quest of an immigrant seeking a better life. It was the desperate flight of a refugee, a last-ditch escape from a continent consumed by hate. It was the beginning of his personal war to ensure that the promise of a sanctuary, a Jewish homeland, would be built and defended with unyielding ferocity. He had lost his family, but he would dedicate his life to protecting a new one. His arrival in Palestine marked the beginning of a new identity. He settled on Kibbutz Ein Shemer, a collective agricultural community where the ethos of self-reliance and mutual defense was paramount. Here, the ideals of labor and protection were intertwined. Every member was a farmer, but every farmer was also a soldier in waiting. The kibbutz provided him with a home, a purpose, and an ideological framework that resonated with his own experiences. The community's belief in collective responsibility for the Jewish future mirrored the vow he had made to himself. Life was Spartan, demanding, and focused on building the foundations of a state. It was here that the boy from Sarajevo began the transformation into a future leader of Israel. In 1946, joining the Palmach was not a choice but an inevitability. It was the elite fighting force of the Haganah, the underground army of the Jewish community, and the sharpest instrument of their will to be free. For Dado and his generation of survivors, military service was the ultimate expression of their Zionism. It was the practical application of the slogan, "Never again." The Palmach was more than an army. It was a brotherhood forged in shared hardship and a common, desperate goal. They were a new type of Jew, one who worked the land by day and trained with a rifle by night. They were the defenders of a dream, the generation tasked with turning 2,000 years of hope into a sovereign reality. The discipline, camaraderie, and relentless training of the Palmach molded him. He absorbed lessons in unconventional warfare, leadership under pressure, and the absolute necessity of initiative on the battlefield. His commander saw in him a quiet determination, a seriousness that came from having witnessed the worst of human history. His past was not a weight that held him down, but a fire that propelled him forward. He was fighting not just for the future, but against the ghosts of his past. The powerless victim of European anti-Semitism was becoming a powerful protector of Jewish destiny. He was preparing for the inevitable conflict that everyone knew was coming, the ultimate test of their resolve. His personal history of loss gave him a clarity of purpose that was absolute. While others fought for ideology or national pride, Dado fought with the searing memory of a family destroyed. Every training exercise, every patrol, every moment spent preparing for war was an act of remembrance and a promise. He was determined to build a nation strong enough to guarantee that no Jewish child would ever have to say goodbye to their family as he had. The survival of his people was not an abstract political concept. It was a deeply personal, sacred duty that had been seared into his soul by the flames of the Holocaust. This profound sense of responsibility would guide every decision he ever made as a soldier and a commander. The lessons of survival in Europe and the ideology of the kibbutz had prepared him for the coming struggle. The Palmach had given him the tools of a warrior and the instincts of a leader. But it was in the crucible of war, fighting for the ancient, sacred streets of Jerusalem itself, that the young immigrant who had lost everything would be forged into a commander. The battle for a state was about to begin, and Dado was ready to pay any price to win it. The raw idealism of the kibbutz was soon tempered by the harsh realities of a looming war. David Elazar joined the Palmach, the elite fighting force of the pre-state Jewish community. This was no ordinary army. It was an institution forged in secrecy and necessity, operating with a unique culture that would deeply influence Dado for the rest of his life. There were no ranks on display, and commanders were known by their first names. The core principles were initiative, improvisation, and leading from the very front. A commander was expected to be the first one to charge and the last one to eat. This ethos resonated with Elazar's character, blending his quiet determination with a fierce sense of responsibility for the men he would lead. His training was intense, practical, and designed for a guerrilla-style conflict against overwhelming odds. He quickly distinguished himself, and as the War of Independence erupted in 1948, he was assigned to the newly formed Harel Brigade. This was the tip of the spear, a unit comprised of the Palmach's finest, handed the most desperate and vital mission of the entire war. Their task was to break the Arab siege of Jerusalem and protect its beleaguered Jewish population. The winding, treacherous road to the city, the Bab el-Wad, had become a death trap. For Dado, the fight was no longer an abstract ideal. He was now a frontline soldier in a battle for the very existence of the Jewish state, with the fate of its ancient capital resting on the shoulders of his brigade. His defining moment came in the urban maze of southern Jerusalem, in the neighborhood of Kadamon. The strategic high ground was dominated by the fortified San Simon Monastery, held by a determined force of Arab irregulars and Iraqi army volunteers. As a company commander in the Harel Brigade's 4th Battalion, Dato was ordered to take the monastery at all costs. The initial assault faltered under withering fire. With casualties mounting and morale wavering, Elazar personally led a second, desperate charge. He and his men stormed the stone walls, crashing through the entrance into a labyrinth of rooms and corridors. The fighting that ensued was brutal and intimate. It was a vicious, close-quarters battle fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets from one room to the next. The air was thick with smoke, plaster dust, and the deafening roar of gunfire. Ammunition ran critically low, and communication was nearly impossible amidst the chaos. Men fought with sheer grit, fueled by adrenaline and the sight of their commander fighting alongside them. Dato moved through the carnage with a chilling calm, directing his men, redistributing a few remaining bullets, and personally engaging the enemy. He was a constant presence at the point of greatest danger, a source of inspiration for his exhausted and terrified soldiers. His personal courage was undeniable. He never flinched, never took a step back. This was the Palmach Creed made manifest, a commander who not only gave orders but embodied the sacrifice he demanded of others. After hours of ferocious combat with heavy losses on both sides, the monastery finally fell. The victory at San Simon was a pivotal turning point in the battle for Jerusalem, securing the southern flank of the city and breaking the back of Arab resistance in the area. For David Elazar, it was a trial by fire that forged his reputation as a fearless and unflappable combat leader. He had proven his ability to lead and inspire men in the most hellish conditions imaginable. Yet, capturing territory was only half the battle. Jerusalem was still starving, its 100,000 residents cut off from the coastal plain. The Harel Brigade was immediately thrown into a new series of grueling operations to secure the road to the city. When the main route proved impossible to hold, an audacious plan was conceived. They would carve a new secret road through the steep, unforgiving hills of Judea. This makeshift path, built by hand and under constant artillery and sniper fire, became known as the Burma Road. Elazar and his company were instrumental in this effort, fighting to capture and hold the strategic ridges that overlooked the route. They provided security for the engineers and volunteers who worked day and night to make the road passable for supply convoys. This experience was a different kind of education in warfare. It was not about the frenzied violence of a frontal assault, but about the grinding, relentless importance of logistics and strategic foresight. He learned that battles were not just won by courage, but by the relentless determination to keep the supply lines open. The successful opening of the Burma Road was a miracle of engineering and willpower, a lifeline that saved Jerusalem from surrender. For Dato, the entire War of Independence, from the bloody corridors of San Simon to the dusty hills of the Burma Road, was the ultimate crucible. It confirmed his place as a rising commander within the military structure of the newly born state. He had demonstrated raw courage, tactical acumen, and the ability to command the loyalty of his men under fire. He had proven his mettle as an infantry commander, but a new age of warfare was dawning, and Dato Elazar would soon find himself at the forefront of a revolution, trading his rifle for the thunderous power of the tank. The War of Independence had forged a nation, but its lessons were written in blood. The Israeli Defense Forces, born from a desperate struggle for survival, recognized a critical vulnerability. Their victory had been won by the courage of its infantry, but it was a grinding, costly affair. A new doctrine was needed for a new reality. The strategic thinkers of the young state concluded that future wars must be won quickly, decisively, and on enemy soil. To achieve this, Israel needed a powerful armored fist, a force capable of shattering enemy armies and carrying the battle deep into their territory. This monumental shift in military thinking required a new kind of commander, one who possessed not just bravery, but an almost visceral understanding of offensive warfare. In David Elazar, the architects of this new strategy found their man. His aggressive, forward-driving spirit, honed in the Palmach, was perfectly suited for the dynamic, high-stakes world of armored combat. He made the transition from infantry to the armored corps in the early 1950s, not as a student learning a new trade, but as a visionary helping to write its fundamental texts. He quickly absorbed the mechanics of tank warfare, but focused on its philosophy. For Elazar, armor was never about defense. He passionately argued that its true purpose was offensive, a tool for deep penetration and psychological shock. He believed armor was not a shield to protect the homeland, but a spear to be thrust deep into the enemy's heartland, to break his will to fight. His ascent within the Corps was meteoric. He was not just a commander, he was an innovator, a driving force behind the development of Israel's unique approach to armored warfare. This doctrine rejected the methodical, cautious advances favored by other armies. Instead, it emphasized speed, audacity, and the commander's initiative on the battlefield. Elazar trained his officers to think independently, to seize opportunities, and to push their machines and their men to the absolute limit. He was shaping an armored force that mirrored his own personality, relentless, daring, and always on the attack. His theories were compelling, but they remained untested in the crucible of a full-scale war. That test would come in the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Sinai Desert. In 1956, the Sinai Campaign erupted, and Colonel David Elazar was given command of the legendary 7th Armored Brigade. His objective was one of the most formidable defensive complexes in the entire Middle East, Abu Aguila. This was not a single fortress, but a sprawling network of heavily fortified positions, deep trenches and vast minefields, all interconnected and supported by dug-in artillery. The Egyptian command considered it the linchpin of their entire Sinai defense, an impenetrable bastion designed to halt any Israeli advance in its tracks. A direct frontal assault would be suicidal, a lesson the Israeli Defense Forces had learned at great cost in 1948. Elazar understood that brute force would fail. He needed a key, not a battering ram, to unlock the Egyptian defenses. He spent days poring over maps and intelligence reports, formulating a plan of breathtaking complexity and daring. His strategy was a masterclass in combined arms warfare, a symphony of violence where every instrument played a critical part. He planned to use paratroopers to drop behind the main lines and seize vital road junctions, cutting off Egyptian reinforcements and escape routes. Simultaneously, a massive artillery barrage would pin down the defenders in their trenches, sowing chaos and disrupting their command and control. Only then, with the enemy blinded, isolated, and suppressed, would his armor strike. But even this would not be a simple charge. Elazar identified a narrow, supposedly impassable track through the desert that would allow a portion of his force to bypass the main defenses and strike the Egyptian headquarters and artillery positions from the rear. It was a high-risk gamble that depended on perfect timing, flawless coordination, and the sheer audacity of his commanders. The fate of the entire southern front and Elazar's reputation as an armor commander rested on the success of this intricate plan. The operation was set in motion on the night of October 30th. The battle for Abu Aguila was fierce and chaotic, a maelstrom of fire and steel under the cold desert stars. The paratroopers secured their objectives, the artillery rained down destruction, and Elazar's tanks, navigating by moonlight, found their way through the treacherous pass. The Egyptian defenders, assailed from the front, rear, and sky, were thrown into complete confusion. Their formidable defensive system, designed to repel a head-on attack, crumbled from within. By morning, the Israeli flag was flying over the command post at Abu Aguila. Elazar had not just broken through, he had annihilated the enemy's defenses. With the linchpin removed, the entire Egyptian front in the Sinai collapsed. Elazar's 7th Brigade was now unleashed. What followed was a stunning display of the very doctrine he had championed. The brigade thundered across the peninsula in a classic blitzkrieg, a lightning advance that left bewildered Egyptian units scattered in its wake. They bypassed remaining pockets of resistance, leaving them for follow-on forces, their eyes fixed on the ultimate prize. Their mission was to advance, to disrupt, to create chaos, and to drive relentlessly forward. The tanks and half-tracks of the 7th Brigade covered hundreds of kilometers in just a few days, an incredible feat of logistics, maintenance, and sheer human endurance. They raced through the desert, their crews exhausted but exhilarated, pushing their machines to the breaking point. This was the vision Elazar had fought for, an armored force that could win a war not by inches but by miles, transforming a single tactical victory into a strategic rout. The Sinai campaign was over in 100 hours. David Elazar emerged from the desert dust as one of Israel's most celebrated commanders. He had proven that his theories were not just classroom concepts, but devastatingly effective principles of war. He had demonstrated to the world, and more importantly to the Israeli Defense Forces itself, the awesome power of a well-led, aggressive armored force. His mastery of the desert battlefield was now undisputed. But a far more formidable challenge loomed to the north, where Syrian guns perched atop an impossible fortress held Israel's communities hostage. By 1964, David Elazar's steady ascent through the ranks brought him to one of the Israeli Defense Forces' most critical posts. As the newly promoted Rav Aleph, or Major General, he assumed the role of General Officer commanding Northern Command. From his headquarters, he stared daily at the formidable challenge that defined Israel's northern border, the Golan Heights. This was not merely a geographical feature, but a strategic nightmare. For nearly 2 decades, the volcanic plateau served as Syria's personal artillery platform, a weapon aimed perpetually at the heart of the Galilee. Life in the Hula Valley below was a grim lottery of survival. Farmers worked their fields under the constant threat of shell fire, children learned to distinguish the whistle of incoming mortars, and every kibbutz was a frontline outpost. The heights themselves were a fortress, a seemingly impenetrable barrier of Syrian military power. They were fortified with layers of concrete bunkers, vast and complex minefields, and machine gun nests positioned for interlocking fields of fire. Military analysts around the world considered an assault on the Golan to be a suicidal endeavor. For Dato Elazar, this was not an abstract problem, but a daily, visceral reality. He was the man responsible for the lives lived in the shadow of those guns. In June 1967, the Middle East erupted. The Six-Day War began with stunning Israeli victories as the Air Force decimated enemy air power and ground forces surged across the Sinai Peninsula. In the Central Front, Jerusalem was unified and the West Bank was captured. Yet in the north, Elazar's command was ordered to wait, to hold a defensive line. For 4 agonizing days, he listened as Syrian artillery intensified its barrage, raining down destruction on the very communities he was sworn to protect. The shelling was indiscriminate and merciless, inflicting casualties on civilians and soldiers alike. Elazar's frustration boiled into a furious resolve. This was a historic, fleeting opportunity to neutralize the threat for good, and he refused to let it pass. He began a relentless campaign, not against the Syrians, but against his own Minister of Defense, the legendary Moshe Dayan. Dayan was deeply hesitant, haunted by predictions of catastrophic Israeli casualties, and wary of international political fallout. He feared a bloody, protracted battle for a fortress that had resisted all previous attempts. The confrontation between the two men became the stuff of legend. Intense meetings and heated phone calls, Elazar forcefully argued, cajoled, and demanded authorization to attack. He presented meticulously prepared plans, dismissing the dire casualty estimates as overly cautious. He insisted that his men were ready and that the morale of the Syrian army was cracking under the weight of their defeats on other fronts. This was not about ego or ambition, it was about a fundamental duty. His friend and colleague Haim Bar-Lev later perfectly captured his motivation. Dado was a man of the people, and his first and last thoughts were about the welfare of his soldiers. He saw the bleeding communities below and believed the highest price was the one they were already paying every day. Elazar staked his entire reputation on the outcome, effectively telling the political leadership that he would personally shoulder the responsibility. He argued that to leave the Syrian guns on the heights after winning everywhere else would be an unforgivable strategic failure. Finally, on the morning of June 9th, the fifth day of the war, a weary Dayan relented. His message to Elazar was terse, a reluctant concession to the northern commander's iron will. "If you want to do it, then do it," he said over the phone. That was all Elazar needed to hear. He immediately unleashed the operation he had rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. The assault was a masterpiece of combined arms and raw courage. Armored bulldozers, their cabins reinforced with extra steel plates, rumbled forward to carve paths through the dense Syrian minefields, often under a hail of direct fire. Behind them, infantrymen of the Golani Brigade began the grueling, near-vertical climb up the treacherous slopes, fighting from one fortified trench to the next. Tanks clawed their way up steep, winding tracks that seemed impassable, providing crucial fire support. Elazar was not a general commanding from a distant bunker. He established a forward command post, moving with the advance, a constant presence on the radio, making critical real-time decisions, and inspiring his commanders with his calm confidence amidst the chaos. The Syrian fortress, considered impregnable for 2 decades, crumbled in just over a day of furious fighting. The swift and decisive victory was a monumental feat of arms, a triumph that silenced the guns over the Galilee and transformed Dado Elazar into a national hero. The conqueror of the Golan, crowned a national hero and conqueror of the Golan, Dado Elazar's path now led to the very pinnacle of the Israeli Defense Forces. But the greatest triumph of his career would set the stage for his most profound and devastating test. In January of 1972, David Elazar reached the zenith of his military career. He was appointed the 9th Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, a position that placed the security of the entire nation in his hands. He inherited an army and a country basking in the warm, confident glow of the 1967 victory. This was not just confidence, it was a pervasive sense of invincibility, a national hubris that settled over the land like a thick fog. The symbols of this assurance were etched into the landscape itself. Along the Suez Canal, the Bar-Lev line stood as a chain of supposedly impregnable fortresses. On the Golan Heights, new fortifications stared down into Syria, monuments to Israeli military might. This feeling of security was codified into a rigid military and intelligence doctrine known as the concept. It was a simple, elegant, and tragically flawed set of assumptions. The concept held that Egypt would never launch a full-scale war without first neutralizing the Israeli Air Force, a capability it did not possess. It also stipulated that Syria would never dare to attack Israel alone, without its powerful Egyptian ally. This doctrine was the bedrock of Israel's defense strategy, a reassuring formula that promised peace through strength. It allowed the nation to breathe easily, to believe that the wars were over. But it was a house built on sand, a catastrophic miscalculation that would soon be shattered. In the weeks leading up to October 1973, the foundations of that house began to tremble. Disturbing intelligence reports trickled in, painting a picture at odds with the official assessment. An extremely high-level source within the Egyptian government, a prized asset of the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad, provided a series of increasingly urgent warnings. The agent, Ashraf Marwan, signaled that Egypt and Syria were preparing for a coordinated, imminent attack. His warnings were specific and detailed, yet they ran directly into the brick wall of the concept. The head of military intelligence, Major General Elazar, remained steadfast. He interpreted the massive Arab military buildup as an elaborate bluff, a large-scale exercise designed to put political pressure on Israel, not a prelude to actual war. He dismissed the contrary reports as part of an Egyptian deception campaign. As chief of staff, Elazar found himself in an agonizing position. He was caught between his own rising sense of unease and the unwavering, confident assurances of his intelligence chief. The system he was trained to trust, the apparatus designed to provide him with clarity, was instead feeding him a comforting fiction. Every fiber of his being was that of a commander who prepared for the worst. Yet the institutional groupthink was overwhelming. His trust in Zira's directorate, a professional obligation, would become a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The entire defense establishment was paralyzed by its own dogma, unable to see the storm gathering just over the horizon. The storm broke on the holiest day of the Jewish year. At 4 o'clock on the morning of Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973, a telephone call ripped David Elazar from his sleep. The message was chillingly clear. The Mossad had received definitive word from its top source. War was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. Egypt and Syria would launch a coordinated attack that very evening. The time for debate was over. Elazar rushed to an emergency meeting with Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, his mind already racing, his offensive instincts fully engaged. Han knew what had to be done. With forceful, urgent clarity, he laid out his recommendation. Israel must not wait to be struck. He advocated for a massive preemptive airstrike against Syrian and Egyptian airfields, missile batteries, and troop concentrations. It was the same strategy that had delivered a stunning victory in 1967. We must hit them now, he argued. We must seize the initiative before they can land the first blow. He knew that every hour of delay would be paid for with the lives of Israeli soldiers. But his plea fell on deaf ears. Prime Minister Golda Meir, joining the discussion, was swayed by Dayan's caution. They were terrified of the political consequences. If Israel struck first, it would be branded the aggressor in the eyes of the world. Crucially, they feared it would alienate their most vital ally, the United States, and jeopardize the flow of military aid they would desperately need. The political risk was deemed too great. Elazar's plan was rejected. He was ordered to stand down the Air Force. Instead, he was authorized to begin only a limited, partial mobilization of the reserves, a fraction of the force he knew was required. He was a commander who saw the enemy's sword poised to strike, yet his hands were tied by his own government. The weight of responsibility was crushing. He knew the nation was sleeping, praying, and wholly unprepared for the cataclysm that was about to unfold. The clock ticked relentlessly toward 2 in the afternoon. His warnings unheeded and his hands tied, David Elazar could only watch as the sirens began to wail across a silent, praying nation. The most desperate battle of his life and of Israel's existence had just begun. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on October 6, 1973, the silence of Yom Kippur was shattered. Across Israel, the sacred stillness of the holiest day of the year was broken by the piercing wail of air raid sirens. What David Elazar had feared, what the intelligence community had dismissed, had become a terrifying reality. In the south, a massive Egyptian army, thousands of soldiers strong, surged across the Suez Canal. They used high-pressure water cannons to blast through the sand ramparts, pouring into the Sinai with overwhelming force. The vaunted Bar-Lev Line, a series of fortified outposts meant to be an early warning system, was swamped in a matter of hours. The thinly manned forts were overrun, their desperate radio calls for help fading into static. Simultaneously in the north, a tidal wave of steel rolled across the Golan Heights. Hundreds upon hundreds of Syrian tanks, a force far larger than anything the Israeli Defense Forces had anticipated, smashed into the initial defensive lines. The first reports flooding into the IDF's subterranean command bunker, known as the Pit, were a symphony of chaos. The teletype machines chattered relentlessly with panicked, fragmented messages of entire units being wiped out. On the large strategic maps, analysts frantically marked advancing enemy arrows that seemed to erase Israel's borders. The scale and ferocity of the coordinated two-front assault were beyond the scope of anyone's worst nightmare. The Israeli Air Force, the nation's ultimate guarantor of security, was being systematically dismantled by a dense web of new Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles, suffering devastating losses. The first few hours of the war were an unmitigated catastrophe. Israel was not just losing, it was on the verge of total collapse. In the heart of the Pit, an atmosphere of despair began to take hold. Seasoned generals, veterans of the lightning victory of the Six-Day War, looked on in stunned disbelief. Even the legendary Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense and an icon of Israeli strength, was visibly shaken. His face ashen, he began to speak in hushed apocalyptic tones about the destruction of the Third Temple, a phrase that signaled the potential end of the state itself. Panic was a contagion, and it was spreading fast. But in this maelstrom of fear and confusion, one man remained an island of absolute calm. David Elazar, his face a mask of intense concentration, stood at the center of the storm. He listened to the catastrophic reports, his eyes fixed on the maps, his mind working at lightning speed. He projected an unwavering confidence that he may not have fully felt, but knew everyone else needed to see. His steadiness was the only anchor in a room threatening to capsize. It was in these darkest hours that Dado made the single most critical decision of the entire war. With both fronts collapsing, resources were stretched to the breaking point. The general staff was divided, with some demanding that reserves be sent south to save the Sinai. But Elazar's strategic calculus was cold, brutal, and correct. He understood that while a defeat in the Sinai would be a devastating blow, it was a loss of territory Israel could, in the worst case, survive. The Golan Heights, however, were different. A Syrian breakthrough on the Golan would place their tank columns minutes away from the Jordan River, with a clear path down into the Galilee and the very heartland of Israel. A defeat in the north was not a disaster, it was an existential threat. With absolute authority, he made his decision. The bulk of the reserves, the precious tank brigades being hastily mobilized, would go north. The Air Force, despite its heavy losses, would prioritize striking the advancing Syrian columns. It was a gut-wrenching gamble. This decision risked losing the entire Sinai Peninsula and the thousands of soldiers fighting there, but Elazar knew it was a risk he had to take. He was sacrificing a limb to save the body. He was choosing to save the country itself. This act of strategic clarity and moral courage, made under unimaginable pressure, defined his leadership. He was not just a commander, he was the nation's last line of defense. His leadership was not confined to grand strategy. It was intensely personal, reaching down into the chaos of the battlefield. He was constantly on the radio, his calm, authoritative voice cutting through the panic of the airwaves. He spoke directly to his field commanders, giving clear, concise orders that steadied their nerves and focused their minds. When he reached Avigdor Ben-Gol, the commander of the decimated 7th Armored Brigade holding the line against impossible odds on the Golan, his words were a direct infusion of will. He knew the brigade was on the verge of breaking. Over the crackling radio, Elazar's voice was resolute. "You have to hold on like the last bastion. You are the state of Israel." He was not just giving an order, he was reminding them of the stakes, that their small, battered force was all that stood between the enemy and their homes. Facing his own shaken general staff in the pit, he saw the doubt and fear in their eyes. He needed to shock them out of their despair and reignite their fighting spirit. He acknowledged the grim reality but refused to surrender to it. His voice rang with a raw, primal determination that electrified the room. "The Syrians have a good army," he conceded, his gaze sweeping over his commanders. Then, his voice hardening, he delivered the galvanizing order that would become the army's rallying cry for the rest of the war. "But we are going to break their bones." These were not mere words. They were a promise, a declaration of intent that transformed the mood from one of impending doom to one of savage resolve. In those first 72 hours, David Elazar's leadership did more than direct the army. It held the nation together and single-handedly prevented a catastrophe. Having held the line through sheer force of will, the moment for defense was over. Now Dato Elazar would unleash a counterattack that would not only save Israel, but would turn the tide of the war in one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. The gamble paid off. On the Golan Heights, where the fate of northern Israel hung by a thread, David Elazar's prioritized reserve forces began to arrive. They were the cavalry cresting the hill in the nation's darkest hour, a torrent of steel and determination pouring into a nearly broken defensive line. Their arrival was not a moment too soon. In a narrow valley that would be forever known as the Valley of Tears, one of the most ferocious armored battles in history was reaching its climax. There, less than 200 Israeli tanks of the 7th Armored Brigade had stood against a tide of nearly 1,000 Syrian tanks and armored vehicles. For 4 days, they fought with near-suicidal bravery, a tiny iron wall against an avalanche. The ground was littered with the burning hulks of hundreds of Syrian tanks, a testament to the skill and sacrifice of the Israeli crews who refused to yield. With the arrival of the reinforcements, the dynamic shifted with breathtaking speed. The desperate defense transformed into a powerful, coordinated counterattack. The tide had not just been stemmed, it was being furiously thrown back. Israeli armored columns, now bolstered and reorganized, smashed into the exhausted and overextended Syrian formations. The Syrian command, which had believed itself on the verge of a historic victory, watched in disbelief as its assault crumbled into a full-scale retreat. The Israeli Defense Forces did not stop at the pre-war border. Elazar ordered his commanders to press the advantage, to ensure Syria could not threaten the Golan again. They surged forward, pushing the shattered remnants of the Syrian army off the heights entirely. Within days, Israeli artillery shells were landing on the outskirts of Damascus itself. The lead elements of the Israeli advance reached a point just 40 kilometers from the Syrian capital, a stunning reversal of fortune that sent shockwaves through the Arab world. The existential threat in the north, the specter of Syrian tanks rolling into the Galilee, had been decisively eliminated. This victory, born from Elazar's strategic foresight and the incredible valor of the soldiers on the ground, was the first great turning point of the war. It freed the Israeli Defense Forces to turn its full attention south, to the second, equally perilous front. In the Sinai, the situation was grimly different. The war had settled into a bloody stalemate. Egyptian forces, having successfully crossed the Suez Canal, had established a continuous and heavily defended line along its eastern bank. They were dug in deep, protected by a dense umbrella of surface-to-air missiles that neutralized the Israeli Air Force. Israeli counterattacks had been repulsed with heavy losses, and morale was beginning to fray. The war of attrition favored Egypt, with its vast reserves of manpower. Elazar knew a direct frontal assault was a recipe for disaster. A new approach was needed, something bold and entirely unexpected. The proposal came from General Ariel Sharon, a brilliant but controversial commander known for his aggressive and often unconventional tactics. In the depth of the command bunker, amidst maps and frantic reports, Sharon laid out his plan. It was breathtaking in its audacity. He proposed not to push the Egyptians back across the canal, but to cross it himself. His division would punch a narrow corridor through the seam between the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd Armies, cross the Suez to the West Bank, and then run wild in the Egyptian rear. The ultimate goal was to swing south and completely encircle the entire Egyptian 3rd Army, cutting it off from its supplies and trapping it on the Israeli side of the canal. The general staff was thrown into turmoil. To many, the plan was sheer madness. They argued that it was a reckless gamble, risking an entire armored division deep inside enemy territory with a tenuous supply line. Generals Shmuel Gonen and Chaim Bar-Lev raised serious objections, pointing out the immense danger of being cut off and annihilated. The debate was intense, a clash of military philosophies under the crushing weight of a war for survival. They saw the potential for a catastrophic failure that could lose them the war on the spot. The risks were astronomical. An entire Israeli division could be lost. Elazar listened to every argument, his face a mask of concentration. He walked around the map table, absorbing the details, questioning the assumptions, and weighing the terrible possibilities. He heard the caution in Bar-Lev's voice and the fire in Sharon's. He understood the risks better than anyone. A failure would not just be a military defeat, it would be a national catastrophe from which Israel might not recover. Yet he also saw the strategic genius in Sharon's vision. It offered not just a tactical advantage, but the potential for a decisive, war-winning victory that a conventional battle of attrition never could. After hours of agonizing deliberation, he made his decision. He turned to his commanders and gave the order. Ariel Sharon had his green light. The fate of the war and of Israel itself now rested on a single audacious maneuver. The operation, codenamed Operation Stout-Hearted Men, began with one of the most brutal battles of the war. To open the corridor to the canal, Sharon's forces had to seize a vast agricultural complex known to the Israelis as the Chinese Farm. The name was a misnomer, based on misunderstood markings on a map, but the fighting there was terrifyingly real. For 2 days, Israeli paratroopers and armored units fought a desperate close-quarters battle against entrenched Egyptian forces. The fighting was at point-blank range, a chaotic struggle for every building and every trench, with staggering casualties on both sides. But they succeeded. A narrow path to the water was secured. Under the cover of darkness, the incredible moment arrived. Engineers frantically worked to assemble a massive pontoon bridge across the Suez Canal, while under constant and heavy Egyptian artillery fire. The first tanks of General Avraham Aden's division, which would lead the main crossing, began to roll across the precarious bridge. It was a surreal scene. Israeli armor crossing into Africa, a continent away from the war's initial front, with shells exploding in the water around them. Once on the other side, the Israeli forces unleashed chaos. They were a knife plunged into the soft underbelly of the Egyptian army. They raced through the Egyptian rear, virtually unopposed at first. Their primary targets were the missile batteries that had crippled the Israeli Air Force. One by one, the missile sites were overrun and destroyed, punching a massive hole in Egypt's air defenses. The sky now belonged to Israel. Israeli jets swarmed overhead, striking supply convoys, command centers, and retreating Egyptian units. Elazar's gamble was paying off in a way few had dared to imagine. The bridgehead on the West Bank expanded rapidly as more and more Israeli forces poured across the canal. The final decisive move came swiftly. The armored columns turned south, completing their great encircling maneuver. The Egyptian Third Army, still dug into its positions on the east bank of the canal, suddenly found itself completely cut off. Its supply lines were severed, and it was trapped between the Israeli forces in the Sinai and Sharon's divisions at its back. The military tide had turned completely and irrevocably. Egypt's stunning initial victory had been transformed into a catastrophic, humiliating defeat. From the very brink of annihilation, David Elazar had orchestrated a complex two-front campaign, leading the Israeli Defense Forces to a clear and stunning military victory. The guns fell silent, and Israel was saved. David Elazar, the architect of victory, stood as the man who had led his nation out of its darkest hour. But in the bitter aftermath of the war, the hero would soon become the scapegoat. The echoes of tank fire had faded, but a storm of a different kind was gathering across Israel. Victory had been secured at a staggering cost, and the nation was in a state of collective shock. The initial days of the Yom Kippur War were not a memory of resilience, but a raw, open wound of failure. The public called it the Mehdal, the blunder, a catastrophic lapse in intelligence and preparedness that had sent thousands of sons, fathers, and husbands to their deaths. The grief was immense, but it quickly curdled into a furious demand for accountability. Who was responsible for leaving the nation so vulnerable? The public outcry became a roar that the government could not ignore, forcing the establishment of a formal commission of inquiry. Headed by the esteemed Chief Justice Shimon Agranat, the commission was given a solemn mandate to dissect the days and hours leading up to the war and identify the precise points of failure. The entire country held its breath, waiting for answers. They needed more than an explanation. They needed someone to blame, a focal point for their anger and sorrow. In the crucible of public opinion, the political leadership, including Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, found themselves under intense pressure. They were the ones who had listened to the intelligence assessments and, crucially, had overruled David Elazar's desperate plea for a preemptive strike and full mobilization. Yet, with masterful political skill, they shifted the nation's gaze away from the cabinet room and squarely onto the military headquarters. The narrative was set. This was a military failure, not a political one. In April 1974, the Agranat Commission released its interim report, and its findings struck the nation like a physical blow. The report was a stunning document of political exoneration and military condemnation. It largely cleared Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan of any direct responsibility, commending their decision-making during the war itself. The blame, the commission concluded, rested entirely on the shoulders of the Israeli Defense Forces. The report methodically dismantled the reputation of the military's high command, but it saved its sharpest and most devastating judgment for one man. David Elazar, the chief of staff who had wrestled victory from the jaws of certain defeat, was singled out as the primary figure responsible. The commission's chilling verdict stated that he bore personal responsibility for the assessment of the situation and the Israeli Defense Forces' preparedness. While others, like the head of military intelligence, were also censured, Elazar was held uniquely accountable for the entire strategic surprise. He read the words in disbelief. The world around him seemed to warp with the sheer injustice of it all. He had been a victim of the same flawed intelligence, had fought against the prevailing complacency, and had begged his political superiors to act. He had then led the army from an impossible position, turning the tide with his iron will and brilliant command. Now, that same army and that same victory were being used as a cudgel to break him. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical assault, a crushing weight that settled deep within his soul. His entire life had been defined by duty and action. Now he faced a final battle not against enemy tanks, but against a pronouncement that sought to erase his life's work and brand him a failure. His response would be his last official act of command, a demonstration of courage off the battlefield. Upholding the sacred principle of command responsibility, a principle he had lived by his entire career, David Elazar submitted his resignation. His letter was not an apology, but a powerful indictment of the injustice he had suffered. He wrote with a clarity born of deep conviction. His letter stated with stark clarity that if a government was not going to back its chief of staff, he could not continue to bear the responsibility for the command of the army. His words were a defense not only of his own honor, but of the very institution he led. He refused to accept the commission's narrative, a narrative that conveniently ignored the political context in which he had been forced to operate. He asserted that it was his conviction that the commission was not just to him, and that he could not accept its conclusion that he was responsible for the intelligence failure and the army's lack of preparedness. It was the final, defiant act of a warrior who refused to be broken, even as his heart was fracturing. The weight of this public disgrace proved to be an unbearable burden. Less than 3 years later, in April 1976, the nation was stunned by the news of his death. At the age of only 50, David Elazar suffered a massive heart attack while swimming. The official cause was medical, but for a nation that understood the man, the truth was far deeper. Many believed, and still believe, that Dado died of a broken heart, crushed by the profound injustice he had endured. His funeral was a somber national event, attended by the very political and military leaders who had stood by as his reputation was sacrificed. It was a late, silent acknowledgement of the tragic hero they had lost. David Dado, Elazar's life was a testament to the profound bond between a survivor and the sanctuary he swore to protect. He was the quintessential Israeli commander, bold, decisive, and leading from the front. From the alleyways of Jerusalem to the sands of Sinai and the treacherous slopes of the Golan, he led Israel's soldiers in its most critical battles, becoming a national hero and an architect of its security. In Israel's most desperate hour during the Yom Kippur War, his steadfast leadership was the rock upon which the nation's survival was built. When all seemed lost, his calm resolve and strategic brilliance turned catastrophic defeat into a remarkable victory. Yet, in the cruelest of ironies, the very war that cemented his place as a military genius also led to his downfall. He became the tragic hero, sacrificed to absolve the failures of others, a burden his heart could not bear. Over time, history has offered the justice that the commission denied him. Today, David Elazar is remembered not as the man responsible for the surprise, but as the commander who masterfully navigated the storm and saved the nation. His legacy is a powerful, solemn reminder of the immense burdens of command, the lonely price of ultimate responsibility, and the unwavering dedication of a warrior who gave his entire life, and ultimately his heart, to the state of Israel. He remains an eternal guardian, a symbol of courage in the face of impossible odds,